Spoštovana skupnost, dober večer in dobrodošli ob naslednjem dejanju festivala Naprej Forward. In sicer pogovor v klobuku Chat in a Hat s kolegom Gajom Delonijem, ki je dopisnik BBC-ja in ne samo BBC-ja iz te regije oziroma Zahodnega Balkana plus Slovenija. Za BBC že nekaj let živi v Ljubljani in je, kot rečeno, naš dober kolega in tudi del, recimo temu, slovenske novinarske skupnosti. Glede na to, da njegova slovenščina še ni, poudarjam, še ni tako napredovala, da bi se lahko pogovarjali o slovenščini, bova nadaljevala v angleščini. Hvala za razumevanje. Seveda ste vsi, ki ste prisotni tukaj v enem hotelu, kasneje vabljeni k neposrednim vprašanjem za kolega Delonija, sicer pa vas bom poskušal, oziroma vaju bova poskušala zabavati v naslednji uri in pol. So I'll switch to English now. Welcome, Guy.
Thank you very much.
Slovenian English journalist based in Ljubljana for some years now. BBC correspondent from the region, I would say Western Balkans plus Slovenia. But not only BBC. So we'll come to that later. So I would like to be sort of systematic because we're both journalists. So I'll start with your place of birth. You're actually from Liverpool, so Liverpudlian.
Liverpudlian, although I actually prefer the word Liverpolitan, which nobody uses anymore.
Okay.
But people
so
use
you're that old?
People, not quite.
Okay.
But people used to use it, and I think it nicely sums
Scouser,
up.
is it not a nice way to?
It depends on who's saying it.
Okay.
If we're saying it, it's okay about ourselves.
Okay, good. So Liverpool or Everton fan?
Liverpool.
Okay, so in red. It's quite dangerous right now in Slovenia to be specifically red. But anyway, why Liverpool? Why not Everton? Because it's somehow Liverpool is. Those are friendly rivalries between Liverpool and Everton. It's not as harsh as in Belgrade or.
Can get quite nasty actually. It used to when I was a boy. It was not funny at all.
Really?
You'd stay away from Liverpool Central Railway Station on derby match days, and it changed in the 80s, and they promoted this idea of it being the friendly derby. And it was almost as if it happened. You know, they willed it into existence.
Okay.
And it helped that both teams were very successful at the time. But among Liverpudlians, the Evertons are now known as the Bitter Blues.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So,
yeah, it's more or less a normal situation there.
It's a normal situation.
Yeah, they're
But we have split families, split friend groups, the whole works. It's quite unpleasant.
Okay, I'm not particularly bothered because I'm a West Ham United fan, as you may see.
Very nicely done.
Special outfit. It's actually a tribute to Trevor Sinclair. I saw him wearing this kind of outfit during the 2006 FA Cup finals in Cardiff. I was there, he was there, we played Liverpool, we lost. It was the Stevie G volley.
There will be 4 minutes of added time.
Yeah. So it was 3-3 after 90 minutes and then after extra time and then the penalties. So, well.
Are you ashamed of your team, Igor?
No. I'm proud of it, but they lost. That was the last FA Cup finals they were in. So let's not talk about football. Okay, Liverpudlian. Slovenians are obsessed with history. English are obsessed with class. So which class? Working class, middle class?
You know, I genuinely had never thought about class.
Really?
Growing up, and I didn't really give it much thought. I don't think until I was maybe even in my 30s.
Okay.
And part of that was because of where I was brought up and how I was brought up. Mm-hmm. So I was brought up in a part of North Liverpool called Seaforth, which strictly speaking is in the metropolitan borough of Sefton. Mm-hmm. It's got a Liverpool postcode. It's where the main Liverpool docks are these days. As a very, pardon me for saying so now, but I just thought of it as home, but you would think of it now as a run-down working class neighbourhood.
Okay.
But I went to an ordinary local school. My mum was a part-time teacher. My dad worked for the city council, doing marriages. He married people for a living.
Really?
So
It's out of fashion right now, I mean, being married.
there we go. It wouldn't have done us very well when I was younger. We'd have had no income. But I
Okay.
genuinely didn't think of class. I mean, it didn't really cross my mind.
Really?
And it was probably because
It's completely un-English.
we were living in a working class neighborhood, but I was always good at school, so my aspirations were to go on to university, have an academic life, and I suppose you'd call those middle class aspirations if you were doing that in the English way.
Okay.
But I never felt like I belonged to any particular class at all. And when I go back these days to Liverpool, among the friends I catch up with, one's a doctor, a family doctor, another one is a bus driver. So it really didn't bother me at all, this idea of class consciousness. Latterly, I've become much more aware of it.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how I feel about the fact that I wasn't so aware of it when I was younger. I think I'm quite glad that I wasn't.
That's interesting because, as I said, it's un-English as it is your name, surname, Delaunay.
Yeah. So that's probably another reason why I wasn't very class conscious. We were always weird. And if you know, there aren't a lot of boys in North Liverpool called Guy Delaunay. I mean, Guy was an odd name anyway, not completely.
Not as odd as, for example, Nigel. It's a name which is virtually disappearing. So there are still guys. But
There were
no
loads of
Nigels.
Nigels around when I was a boy, though.
Yeah, but they're old. No new Nigels.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. You see, when you say old, I'm taking that personally, Igor.
You can take it. No problem.
But so Guy was a weird name. Delaunay was a weird name. I didn't speak with a strong Liverpool accent, which most of my schoolmates did, or many of my schoolmates did. So that was due to my mum being a teacher and insisting that I spoke properly. And it was always a bit odd being called Guy Delaunay in Liverpool, to be fair. And you're right, it's a French name, but it goes back so far. It's not really useful to me. The Delaunays arrived in the UK, in England and London, in 1823. A neighbour very kindly, for some reason, it sounds like stalker behaviour, but they did our family tree.
Okay.
And it turns out that Pierre Felix Delaunay arrived in 1823 in London, and he was our forebear. And presumably it was a sort of slow slide down the sort of social and wealth rankings, because I doubt Pierre Felix would have been very at home in the dock side of North Liverpool. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. But we know that, for example, in the English language, the sophisticated words come from French. So it's actually a good thing to have a French surname in England. You know, it's extraordinary, like extraordinaire.
Yeah,
And,
but when you grow up in an Irish city like Liverpool, because Liverpool's very strongly Irish in part, 50% of the population when I was a boy were Catholic, so people assume your name is Delaney. When they look at it, they take out the letter U, and they change you from being French into being Irish. So it's just annoying, really.
Well, okay, you were good at school, so I presume because you're a journalist now, your first life goal was to be a striker with Liverpool
Absolutely.
FC. Yeah.
Yep.
And when you didn't succeed in that, you thought, wow, journalism, that would be a really good thing.
I was certainly interested in broadcasting from quite a young age, and I'd make. Oh gosh, I used to write into the local radio stations, because Liverpool had two really good local radio stations when I was a boy. There was the BBC station Radio Merseyside, and there was the commercial station Radio City. And they both had great programmes, really good local programming, whether that was music or news or human interest or what have you. It was in really the golden days of local radio in Britain, 1970s, 1980s. Very strong newsrooms. Even in the commercial radio station, there was a very strong newsroom in that station. Very strong on Radio Merseyside as well. And the programming was just terrific. And they wanted to get listeners involved, and you'd write into them and they'd have little things where you could come in and do something on air. And I got into a couple of those when I was a teenager.
So that was the click, well, I want to be a journalist.
Not I want to be a journalist, but I want to broadcast.
Okay.
And it was always about broadcasting more than anything else.
Okay, because another option in Liverpool would be music,
Yeah.
apparently. But yeah, I think you have a really strong and cultivated interest in music.
Oh, well, music's my passion, and much more than really anything else, to be honest with you. And
Even more than football?
even more than football, when it comes down to it. So, I mean, the greatest fear of my life would be going deaf. That would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to me.
Science is progressing, so that could be there
Yeah.
could be solutions for that in some years' time. But anyway, so I mean, music we can talk about it a little bit later. So basically, you want to be a broadcaster. So that's why you went to study journalism, or
Oh no, I studied history, so
so you're actually a journalist who studied history.
he studied history and then has a
For
master's degree.
Christ's sake, this is something
History is quite
we-
useful for a journalist sometimes.
I know some historians who are journalists, and I'm quite skeptical about it. Okay, no.
You know another one now.
No, but my mum was historian, so it's okay. I mean, basically, but so you studied history because now you're in the region. You probably studied
Yep.
History of former Yugoslavia or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. We would do the Balkan Wars, of course, origins of First World War. That was what we knew about, and you'd have.
No, but
these-
that was your speciality, or
It was part of it. I mean, if you're in a, I don't know how fascinating this is to anybody, but if you're in a British school system, at least when I was at school, you would end up doing what we called modern history, and modern history basically ended at the Second World War.
Of course.
And if you were
because in Slovenia the present started in 1941. You know?
Yeah. So we we didn't touch anything. I did at university, but I didn't at school. You'd only go up to the Second World War. We didn't even get that far.
Okay.
I think we got to the first shot of the First World War. That was as far as we got. But yeah, I used to know all about the Balkan Wars. I used to know important things about the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, many of which have been forgotten, I'm afraid to say. But
There's an interesting football club in Novi Pazar. They play in the second Yugoslav division. But okay, so history. You mentioned university. Where? Oxford, Cambridge,
Leeds.
Leeds. Wow.
So it's another football city.
Yeah, great city.
But
And music, Kaiser Chiefs. And so on.
yeah, well, we were. Leeds was in one of its fallow periods, I would say, for music at the time, and this is how it goes with British cities. We're known as a country which exports music to the rest of the world, and at any given point, cities have a scene. Whether that's Bristol in the 90s, Manchester in the late 80s, Liverpool in the early 80s, and back in the 60s, of course. But there are times when those scenes fall fallow, and early 80s in Leeds would have been great, with innovative bands like Soft Cell and the early versions of The Cult and things like that. Early 90s would have been good, because that would have been really deep into club culture, really influential nightclubs like Back to Basics, which people would go from all over the country to Leeds to go there. I was not there in the early 80s or the early 90s. I was there in the late 80s. And it was desperate.
I'm sorry for
really
that.
Was.
Yeah. But Leeds University is quite known. So you have a brilliant education, and then you decide to going into broadcasting.
Oh no. And brilliant's pushing it, Igor. To be fair, and let's not make any great claims here. I always say, before I got into journalism at the age of 26. I'd spent a long time doing some very heavy mucking about, which I think was quite useful for me as a journo eventually.
Okay.
I think it's very good to have some sort of hinterland that's not in journalism.
And that was?
Oh, it was heavy mucking about, but it was also heavy mucking about in Japan.
Japan?
Yeah, well, the idea of having a job at the age of 21 horrified me. I tried to go to film school in Santa Barbara. They turned me down, so that's, I'm sure, a great loss. to the cinematic arts. The gig that I did get was in Japan on this thing called the JET program, which is where they send young English-speaking people who know nothing to Japan and ask them to pretend to be English teachers in Japanese high schools. And that was it.
So you were big in Japan?
I was big in Japan. In fact, you've put a finger on it there, Igor, because I enjoyed Japan so much, I thought I'd like to study more about it. So after I'd finished being an English teacher, and I was actually a much better student of Japanese language than I was a teacher of English.
Because you're fluent in Japanese?
I'm fluent in Japanese. And, you know, at the time, it was very rare to find Japanese people who spoke English, particularly in the city I was living in, which was called...
And even the Japanese who were speaking English were hardly to understand?
They were very shy about it.
Yeah.
And they'd been taught English in a very unhelpful way, because of the way Japanese language is structured, which is it's a syllabic language. It's quite simple in some ways. I mean, it's if you spoke Italian or Finnish, you'd be okay, I think. But it's quite simple. The pronunciation is very easy. There's none of these dreadful in-between vowels like you have in Slovene.
Yeah. Although they can't pronounce L, so that
no, they can't. Yeah. So my home city in Japan is Ribapur,
and you know it's interesting. They say Surovenia to Slovenia,
yeah.
And you know what Suro means in Slovenian? Not yet. Okay, no problem.
Don't put me on the spot.
So big in Japan.
Yeah, big in Japan. Big in Japan was actually, it was called Not So Big in Japan. That was the title of my master's dissertation. Because I was working, I did end up working in the music industry. I was at Sony Records in Tokyo. And I'd somehow talked myself into a work placement there while I researched the Japanese music industry, and specifically there's this myth of Western bands being big in Japan. Has anybody seen Spinal Tap? Okay, there's a few, great. If you haven't seen it, and this whole idea, this washed-up rock band, when everything looks at this absolute lowest ebb, they're told they need to fly out to Tokyo because they're big in Japan. And the implication being that even the worst possible Western music in the world would go down a storm in Japan. And there was a lot of this disseminated in the English music press, the British music press at the time, which was very, very powerful and influential. The NME, the Melody Maker sounds, and they'd always, every few weeks, there'd be somebody on the front cover surrounded by a load of Japanese girls, such and such a band, big in Japan. And I knew it was a load of rubbish. I knew that what was selling wasn't Western, it was Japanese, 80% Japanese. And I wanted to look at how things actually were and how things had turned around, because they used to be much more popular and it had declined. So how Japan embraced its own music scene and really rejected what was coming from the West. And I did that while I was working at Sony Records, which was tremendous fun.
That was before you became journalist?
Yep, that's right. And what got me into journalism really was when my girlfriend's father asked me, did I know anybody who could write a story for the weekly Japanese news magazine that he wrote for about the crisis at a newspaper in the UK called The Independent. And The Independent had been a startup newspaper in the late 80s. It had got a lot of attention because, to start up a daily quality newspaper was something which hadn't been attempted for decades upon decades. And it had done very well at first. And then there was this crisis in the early 90s. And so Setsuo asked me did I know anybody? And I said, yes, I'll do it. And I guess I was feeling fairly confident because a lot of what I've been doing with the dissertation was interviewing people in the music business. And I felt that was quite journalistic. And in fact, that was the critique that I got from my tutor at university, that there was a lot of interesting information, but it was very journalistic. It wasn't academic enough, which I guess meant it wasn't boring enough. That's probably it, isn't it? So so I ended up writing this piece for Shukan Kinyobi in English, which was then translated into Japanese, and that was my first piece of journalism.
Really, and that changed everything. That changed your life.
No,
not yet.
It did not.
No.
It did not.
How
No.
come?
Well, you know, it was never going to be a regular gig, let's be fair. And at the time, I still had in my head, hey, I'm working at Sony Records. I'd like to work in the music industry. Music's my passion. This is what I want to do. But I don't want to be a professional foreigner at a Japanese record company. And that was the danger. The tasks I was getting in Sony at the time were very much to do with the fact that I was British. And one of the tasks was transcribing lyrics. So it was very, very important in Japan that when somebody buys a CD, that they have the lyrics inside. And as you know, some records don't come with the lyrics. So when that happened, they would get some idiot at the record company to write down the lyrics. And then this lyric sheet would appear in there with a Japanese translation written in parallel. And there was a band called Mercury Rev, who were signed to Sony very, very briefly. They were a very un-major label type band, but they were signed to Sony at that time. And I was transcribing the lyrics for their album, and their lyrics were really, I couldn't make head or tail of them. So I just thought, okay, I'll write something down. And for one line, I wrote down, Marmite jars full of fluid-filled eyes. And I thought, somebody will check that. It'll be okay. And a couple of weeks later, they say, hey, the Mercury Rev album's back from the printers. Here's your copy. And I opened it up. Marmite jars full of fluid-filled eyes, with an asterisk next to it. And down at the bottom, it explained in Japanese what Marmite was and what you do with it. And many years later, in fact, only a few months ago, I ended up in a Twitter conversation with the guitarist from Mercury Rev, whom I'd come to like very much, having had to listen to their album over and over and over. And I told him what had happened with that, and he was very tickled. Bless him. He didn't tell me what the actual line was, though. So it remains a mystery.
Yeah, really. Okay. But every big career has to have some mysteries. So, okay, when did you become journalist, for Christ's sake?
It was about the time that I realised I wasn't getting anywhere in the music business. Possibly this was to do with the Marmite, but who can say? And my mum, bless her, would flick through the adverts in the back of The Guardian in the media section, because she knew that was an interest of mine as well. And she would circle jobs and say, hey, how about you go for this one? And there was a job advertised at the BBC's written archive section for an archive assistant. And I've got a history degree. I've spent time in archives. I know what an archive is. Okay.
And that was it.
I'll go for it. But I wasn't really terribly enthusiastic about it, but I went for it. And they asked me at the interview, what are your favourite programmes? And I told them Top of the Pops and Red Dwarf, which was a science fiction comedy show. And I think everybody else said Newsnight and Panorama, so they hired me. And then from that point...
Red Dwarf, remember this. Red again.
Oh, yes. It's terribly significant. You know, one of my favourite films is Three Colours Red.
Huh.
But we'll skim over that, shall we?
Okay.
But yeah, when you're at one of these archives, it's a funny place, the BBC Written Archives. It's got everything that's ever been written down in the BBC or to do with the BBC. So everything from artist contracts through to memos, policy notes, and things which are covered by the Official Secrets Act as well. You know, there were things that I was not allowed to show anybody because they were still covered by the Official Secrets Act, largely to do with wartime operations and cooperation with the spy agencies.
And
in fact, I've probably just broken the Official Secrets Act right now.
Yeah. And you studied it? Yeah.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah.
But you're doing research for programs while you're there. So there'll be programs, I can remember there was one called the BBC at War. And they were asking me what was happening with BBC policy towards reporting what was going on at the Nazi death camps. How was the BBC reporting that? And I would research it and I'd package it up for them. And after a while, you realise, hang on a second, I'm doing this at this funny little library out in Caversham Park in Berkshire. Why don't I do it directly with the programmes themselves? And it took a couple of leaps through another couple of libraries, but eventually I got a job with Radio 5 Live as a production assistant, about a year into Radio 5 Live's existence. And Radio 5 Live was great. It was still is, a rolling news and sport national network for the BBC. And this is one of the best pieces of advice I can ever give a young journalist in particular, is when something new is starting, get on board, because it will never be as good as that again. There will be no boundaries. You will look back years later and you'll say, how on earth did that get on air? And I look back at when Channel 4 started in the UK in the 1980s and think, how did that get commissioned? Some great stuff, but you really do think, how on earth did that get on air? And 5 Live was like that at the time. There was stuff that was going out, some of which I was responsible for. Chess on the radio. What was going on there?
Yeah. No, but what I find striking is actually, journalists, when their careers are over, and so they're being put into archives.
Yeah.
You did the other way.
That's
so
it,
you started in the archive, then went to, let's say, booming radio program, 5 Live.
Yeah.
So, because it's interesting, I remember a guy named Deloney who was actually in 1998 reporting from the same event as myself,
Yeah.
the Nagano Winter Olympics.
So this is where everything comes together.
Yeah.
You've got your Japanese language and your knowledge of Japan, and you're working for a news and sport network, and you say to them, hey, how about I fly out to the Winter Olympics and don't do the sport stories, but I do all the colour around it. And if you were in Nagano, you'll know what an amazing
I somehow
event
remember
it was.
you, but no problem. There was a weird BBC reporter flying around, so yeah, that was you.
That was the thing about Nagano. When I see Winter Olympics in places like Beijing, I think they're missing the point. I mean, a Winter Olympics should be somewhere
In the Japanese Alps.
compact
Yeah.
that really takes over the entire place and transforms it for those 2 weeks. And for those 2 weeks, it was just, and in the run-up as well, it was just pulsating with the Olympic spirit, which is not something one usually associates with the Olympics, which is full of some of the most corrupt people I've ever met in my life.
98 was different, probably.
It was just when the Salt Lake City scandal was brewing up nicely, actually, at that point.
Okay, so Fitz, Radio 5 Live, Japan. Well, then I missed the connection, because then you suddenly appear in Cambodia.
Sure. And I think there's different kinds of careers you can have as a journalist. Some people, or indeed as a human being, some people know exactly what they want to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think Igor was trying to say, has your life dream always been to be a journalist? Well, no, it hasn't. For some people, it was. And I met some of those people at Radio 5 Live when I first went there, and all they ever wanted to do was to be a journalist. And they did degrees in journalism and got into either the BBC News Trainee Scheme or into BBC local radio stations, and then they ended up on a national network. And that wasn't the way I'd gone about it at all. But I wanted to, well, as I said, there was a lot of mucking about, and I wanted to do that in my journalism career as well. I don't see why I have to take my career seriously. I can take my job seriously, but I don't need to take my career seriously at all. And if there's something that seems interesting, I'll give it a try. And so after Nagano, which I was doing from a news point of view, a World Service Sport asked me if I'd work for them, still sort of applying my news journalist sensibility, but to sports stories full time. And I thought, why not? And that gave me the chance to travel all over the place. And so I was going back to Japan, I was going to Bangladesh, China, I did the Sydney Olympics. So I got to go all over. I mean, what a treat. And to do fun, interesting stories. And one of the most interesting was when I did a series about disability sport. And that's how I ended up in Cambodia, because I was asking people, look,
I have to insert myself, every big career in journalism has something to do with sport journalism. So, yeah, I mean, it's...
But
Okay.
it's well, it's unscripted drama.
Yeah, it's
sports
and
journalism. So
and it teaches you so many skills you need in let's say normal reporting.
you need to be extremely rapid.
Yeah.
You know, if you're slow with your report from a sports event, what's the point?
Yeah.
You know, and you have to be concise. You have to be understandable. You have to relate the atmosphere of the event. And there are people who are terrific at it, and those who are less terrific, it really shows.
So generally, there's no. I mean, there are also bad sport journalists, but there are no good journalists without having something to do with sport journalism. But okay. So disability series and Cambodia. And that is also a connection, because we know what happened in Cambodia in 70s and 80s.
And that was a real. I mean, it was a gift for me doing that series, and there was a friend of mine badgered me into it, a guy called Ricky Singh, and Ricky was disabled himself. He had spina bifida, so he was generally a wheelchair user. And Ricky kept on saying to me, "Come on, guy, come on." He was a Liverpool supporter as well. Wasn't from Liverpool, but he was always asking me to get tickets for him for Liverpool. And he would go, "Come on, guy, you got to do something on disability sport. You got to do it." And I said, "Okay, Ricky." In the end, I pitched doing a little series on disability sport when we were in the run-up to the Olympics and Paralympics in 2000. And I was aware by this point that there's a lot of technology involved with disability sport. I mean, you see people with their carbon fibre running legs and their mega-fast racing wheelchairs and all the specialised equipment which we've just seen in the Winter Paralympics. And I thought, well, that's great if you're from a country like Britain or the United States or Germany and probably Slovenia. But what if you're from a developing country? You know, we can see that in the track and field athletics, you can be from a country which has recently been at war and doesn't have a lot of money, and you can still win gold medals. But what about in the Paralympics? The field seems less level. And I started asking around, where should I go to do this story? And people kept saying Cambodia, because there's lots and lots of lower limb disabilities because of landmines.
Yep.
And also because they had a disability sport program in volleyball. Their idea being that if they could get people doing standing volleyball, that would be important to rehabilitation. And they had developed a way of doing very cheap prosthetic limbs made from recycled PVC. And I thought this sounded great, but I was scared because the war in Cambodia had been over for 3 years at this point. The Khmer Rouge was still kidnapping and murdering Western tourists into the late 1990s. So I was a little bit, I was a little bit apprehensive. But I went and spent about a week or 10 days there doing this documentary. And I really loved it.
The Khmer Rouge would have, let's say, a faible for red color, so you were somehow protected, I would say.
Yes, I didn't want to put it to the test. Igor.
Yeah, I can understand.
That's for sure.
Yeah,
but it felt so. I'd expected, having been to Bangladesh, which was one of the greatest assaults on my senses that I've ever experienced, particularly Dhaka, the capital. And I even had a friend living there, a friend I grew up with, Han. We both grew up in Seaforth in North Liverpool, and he's gone on to be a UN diplomat. And it's quite funny, these two lads from Liverpool, from Seaforth, his dad ran a second-hand shop called the Seaforth Swap Shop. And at one point, I can remember I was in I was waiting to interview Ivica Dacic, who was at that point was Prime Minister of Serbia, and Liverpool and Everton were playing. And I texted Han, who's another great Liverpool supporter, and I said, I'm sitting here waiting to interview the Prime Minister of Serbia, but I really want to be watching the match. And he just texted me back saying, well, I'm sitting on Nelson Mandela's lawn. Because by this point, he was the UN representative in South Africa. So it was... But if I just rewind it a bit, Cambodia didn't feel like Bangladesh at all. It had a completely different vibe to it. So it was an early lesson in, you know, all developing countries are not the same. And I wanted to go back, and when I was getting turned down for foreign correspondent jobs because of my colourful CV, because I'd been mucking about with my career and doing sport and music and that sort of thing, and I hadn't been doing what one would consider a sort of standard progression in news journalism. What do you do at a time like that? And what you do is you take yourself off to a place where there isn't a foreign correspondent, and you give it a go. So I resigned my staff job at the BBC, and I had the blessing of BBC News Gathering, and I did the rounds in the building and talked to all these different programme editors. Would you be interested in stories from Cambodia? Oh, yes, sure. And there were people saying, you'll never make a living. You know, this person's tried it, they couldn't do it. This person's tried it, they couldn't do it. And I just thought, well, they weren't me, were they? And terrible, isn't it? But you have to have, I mean, you can call it arrogance or you can call it self-belief, but you have to think, I've got a plan and I know how to execute it.
The Spaniards call it cojones.
There you go.
Yeah,
yeah, Geo Jones, my dad used to call that.
Yeah.
But,
so actually, you quit the job with the BBC and go freelance to Cambodia to work for the BBC.
Correct.
Okay.
So that was the way it had to be done, and I've been freelance ever since. And I have to say, I like it a lot. It would be very difficult to go back on the staff of an organisation now. There are so many things I like about it, that it feels very adult. You don't feel institutionalized. You're making your own decisions. You succeed or fail on your own merits. You don't get your hand held. But on the other hand, nobody's looking over your shoulder. So these are all things which I like a lot. And generally, I find that editors and producers back in base in London or in my hub bureau, which is currently Brussels, they're actually grateful that you're there, rather than taking you for granted, which is, it's extraordinary sometimes. You know, they'll call me at 8 o'clock in the evening. So sorry to be calling you so late, Guy. I'm thinking, 8 o'clock in the evening? You know, that's not late, is it? It's completely reasonable. You know, and if there's a story on my patch that somehow I've missed and it's popped up on the news wires, I want to know about it. So, but yes, it's a wonderful arrangement.
Yeah, but isn't it a little bit risky to go to Cambodia, which is a country which is probably not the safest in the world, and actually trying to, let's say, make your living by reporting from Cambodia to...
It was a big risk.
Yeah.
You know, when I sold my house to do it, you know, that was the reason I felt able to do it. And by this point, I was married. I'd been married for a year at this point to Lisa. And Lisa and I, when we met, we both owned... Well, you know, the banks obviously own most of the property, but we both own properties in London. And we thought, okay, if we're leaving, we'll sell one and we'll keep the other. And the money that I got from selling one it's the insurance money. And, you know, a version of it is still there because there is no safety net. If something bad happens to me and I can't work, if there's no sick pay, there's no... I'd probably get some statutory Slovenian sick pay, actually, but I'm sure it wouldn't be...
Don't count on that.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
But, you know, there isn't any sick pay. There's no holiday pay. If things go wrong, you're more or less on your own. So you do need to have... That's one of the things you need to think about. And I always thought I want to have a year's earnings, you know, on standby, just in case the worst happens. So that was what enabled us to do it.
Does this influence your work?
In terms of what I report on?
Not, but how you approach work, how do you feel while working? I mean, you have actually to grab every opportunity, or
to a degree.
Not.
I mean, you know, a lot of freelancers will tell you it's very difficult to say no, but I do say no, and I'll say no to news outlets which I don't want to report for. And I've done that quite a lot this year, actually, especially with this Novak Djokovic story.
We'll come to that.
I was getting a lot of requests from people that I would not work for, and I just won't. And so, you know, some people's money is not money that I want, and there's some work that I don't want to do. But I'd be lying if I didn't say, well, okay, if the BBC calls me up at 11 o'clock at night and says, oh, would you mind just filing? And we call these 30-second radio pieces, we call them voice pieces or dispatches, and they sometimes want one to either run through the night or to start running on the very early morning bulletins. And could you just do this for us, Guy? Would you mind? And on the one hand, you think, I want to go to bed. On the other hand, you think, hang on a second, if I do that, that's the equivalent of, you know, I don't know, a nice meal out or something like that. You rationalize it that way. So when you're not getting a salary and you actually know what the rate for each piece is, and that's how freelance journalism works, then you do start equating it with, well, hey, that's the cost of a nice meal. That could be a weekend away. I could get a new guitar for that. You know, that's... doesn't happen often.
Okay, so you're in Cambodia now. You report as a freelancer. You can't speak the language, but
I could speak Khmer well enough to let people know I wasn't a tourist. But I was quite dispirited. Has anybody ever tried speaking Khmer, the language of Cambodian? They have 26 different vowel sounds. 26. And I came from, you know, being fluent in Japanese, and I thought, hey, you know, I speak Japanese. I learned Japanese, and I was pretty fluent in 6 months. Whoa, aren't I great at languages? I'm sure if I live here in Cambodia in 6 months, I'll be fluent. And then you encounter the 26 different vowel sounds. And I'm sitting there with my Khmer teacher, Chani, and he's going through these... If you ever see Khmer script, it looks a bit like Thai script. The way they're written is quite similar, both derived from Sanskrit. And he's showing me all these different vowels, and he says, now, this one is A, and this one is A. What's the difference? All I could tell you is he's pulling a slightly different face when he did the second one. So yeah, I could speak Cambodian a little bit, but after a while I realized that so many people were struggling to speak my language, and here I was banging my head against a wall to speak a language that only 14 million people at the outside speak. Maybe I should not be so hard on myself. So I backed off after a while.
Okay, I think you were, 7 years in Cambodia?
8 years.
8 years, yeah. So why did you leave?
Why did we leave? It was a case of leave now or stay forever. And you reach these points. Well, I do anyway. Every so often you come to a fork in the road. It's a fork, isn't it? Not a crossroads, because crossroads would imply that you have a chance of going back or turning left or right and just going straight. Well, it isn't. It's a fork. You can go in one direction, you can go in another. And you know when they're coming, and you can feel it building up inside yourself. And there was one with Cambodia. For the last year that I was there, I didn't realize until we left that something had been pressing on my chest right about here for 1 year, because I knew we had to do something. And it was either put down some serious roots. We thought about starting a journalism project in Cambodia, actually sort of a base for international journalists, more of whom were coming through Cambodia at that point, as it was obvious that it was now a safe and interesting and desirable place to live. Actually, Cambodia isn't safe. It wasn't safe when we lived there. I mean, you actually had to look after yourself. You couldn't assume that the electricity wasn't going to kill you. You couldn't assume that you weren't going to be hit by a driver who would then just run back over you to make sure that you were dead. You know, never drive down a road when it was dark, because a buffalo might come through the windscreen at you. You had to look after yourself. Yeah. It was one of those things. But we thought that might be a thing. We could do this, I've forgotten what we were going to call it, journo base or something like that. We were going to, have it being a place where journalists could meet, could work.
A hub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Could have been Journo Hub. That might have been it. Or leave. And the BBC job in Japan came up. And I thought, okay. So I got in touch with them and said, would you like me to apply for this? And they said, yes, absolutely. You'd be really well qualified.
Well, the guys in London.
This is it, the guys in London. And I said, are you sure about this? Because, I've been here before. You go for a job and you do a really good interview. You prepare for ages. You do a good interview. And then this happened to me literally 3 times. They'd ring you after the interview. They'd say, that was a great interview. That was really great. In fact, it's one of the best interviews I've ever heard. But I'm really, really embarrassed about this. But we kind of promised this other guy the job before the interviews. But if he gets run over...
That was not Slovenia, that was Britain.
Yep.
Okay.
There we go. And now this is out there forever, isn't it? But yes, I had that a few times. And I once was told, if the other guy was run over by a bus tomorrow, we'd have no hesitation in giving you the job.
Or by a buffalo, but he was not in Cambodia.
Right. Yeah. So I was approaching the Japan job in this light. Now, are you really, really sure? Because if you ask me to do this, I'm going to take it seriously. I'm going to put in loads of research and I'm going to do it properly. And they said, no, we're really sure. It's an open process. Please apply. Which I did. And then
Japan.
Then a week later, they rang me back and said, we're really, really, really embarrassed about this. And you can imagine what came next. And I rang up one of the editors in London in a state of what we call in British English high dudgeon. High dudgeon means you're not very pleased at all. And I said to this editor, listen, you're meant to be looking out for us freelancers. You'd said that when there were opportunities coming up, you'd let us know about them, those of us who are interested in moving. And I haven't heard from you in 2 years. What's going on? And he stuttered a bit, said how sorry he was about the thing with the Japan job. And as he's stuttering away, I can hear him, even though it's on the phone, I can hear him scanning the map on the wall of his office, which has got little pins on it where all the correspondents are. And he's stuttering away, and then suddenly he says, oh, there's no one in Belgrade. Would you be interested? I thought, Belgrade? I would be interested. And I jumped on a plane within a couple of days, flew over to Belgrade. It was during would have been European Football Championships in 2012? Euro 2012, yeah. So it would have been during Euro 2012.
In Ukraine and Poland.
If you insist.
Yeah.
And so it was very, very hot in Belgrade, which was fine, because, so is Cambodia. And I thought, what a fantastic city this is. Amazing, loads of great stuff going on, really interesting people. Yeah, sending photographs back to Lisa, and the family's all going, wow, that looks really good. Flew back, and Lisa said, let's go now before they change their minds. And we packed up 8 years of life in Cambodia and left in 3 weeks. And, we just told them we're going Belgrade, thank you very much, that'll do us. So that was how Belgrade came up, but it's a little bit of serendipity. Sometimes these little doors open a crack, and you give them a good shove.
Okay, so and then you knew the history of the region until 1945.
Yeah. Do you know what? I didn't want to file. So we arrived in August of 2012, and I really, really, really didn't want to do any reporting because I knew how complicated things were. And I didn't want to get it wrong, because I knew that if I got it wrong early on, that would hang over me for a long time. And I actually, about 2.5 months, I spent getting to know the region, reading a lot.
Because it's not only Serbia, it's also Bosnia and then Montenegro and then Northern Macedonia and Albania.
Yep.
And Croatia and Slovenia.
It's eight countries, if you recognise Kosovo, which
Sorry,
Slovenia does and Britain
yeah.
does. So I think we're on safe ground. I have to say 7 when I'm in Serbia.
Yeah, okay. 7 to 8, 7.5. Okay, because I mean, yeah, of course, you do a lot of reporting from Kosovo too. So I mean, you're now in the region, but then you actually decide to move from Belgrade to this fantastic city of Ljubljana.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a fantastic city. So
how to say the nicest town on earth?
The most what? The prettiest town on earth. Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, you know, we would come here. I think the first time I actually came to Ljubljana was during the European elections in 2014, and I just was. Here's a nice English word for you. I was gobsmacked, and I thought the place just looked absolutely terrific. And I came back quite a few times after that, doing various different assignments. I did something about the graphic art biennial for Monocle, which was really mind-bending. Which is a magazine you also work for? That's right. But yeah, I mean, Ljubljana just seemed great. And I haven't owned a car since 1991. And I love cycling, but cycling in Belgrade was a blood sport. Didn't stop me doing it, but there were altercations. And to be in a place where cycling is a matter of fact rather than a statement that you feel you need to make was terrific. And I liked the sanity of Ljubljana at that point as well very much. And yeah, we liked it a lot. And when Britain decided to commit suicide, you know,
it actually didn't succeed completely, but
it's quite bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I just had an
yeah,
experience today. I've always had this annual car hire excess insurance policy, because you know when you go to the car hire window and they say, would you like to take our extra insurance? That'll be, you know, €20 extra a day to reduce your excess from €900 to nothing. And no, I don't want to do that. Thank you very much. Well, there was a British company that for £50 a year would insure the excess. I loved it. It was great. I just tried to renew it today. Because Britain has left the European Union, it's not happening, kiddo. And we could see it coming. I mean, we by this point, we felt... You don't realise how European you feel until the prospect of that being taken away happens to you. And we were here in Ljubljana on the day of the vote in 2016, because the day after, on the 24th of June, it was Statehood Day in Slovenia. Do you call it Statehood Day? Yeah,
it was actually the day after. It was Sunday. It was a Saturday, so yeah, but it was actually connected.
The vote was on a Thursday, so it would have been a Friday.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, it was 25th anniversary of independence, and loads of heads of state from all over the EU were due in Ljubljana. So my job was basically to doorstep them as they went in to the presidential palace, and the idea being all these, you know, the president of Germany, who nobody could name, of course, in Britain, but you know, all these heads of state, sorry. We're going to say, oh, yes, isn't it marvellous? Britain's voted to stay in the EU. Thank goodness we cleared that up. I thought it was going to be a very simple assignment. Instead, I found myself sitting in Miro Cerar's office, him looking at me looking at him, both of us going... And we started on that day, Lisa and I, well, right, okay, how do we take back control? Right, how do we take back control of this situation? And I think you can, in anything that happens to you, professionally or personally, I think you can, to a degree, well, you can do what you can to influence it. And we thought, okay, the best way to influence this would be to move to an EU country on our patch. And
with cycling tracks.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That was a really big thing. I mean, the quality of life issue is enormous. If you can cycle around, if you've got a city which takes that seriously and takes walking seriously and has reasonably sane bus transport.
And of course, there was another thing that you have a transport hub which really covers the region well. Huh? So you have flights to Pristina and Tirana and Belgrade.
So this was how I sold it to the BBC. Actually,
that was in the old days when an airlines company still existed and so on. So you decide to come to Ljubljana because it's a great transport hub.
Well, that was certainly how I sold it to the BBC. I said, look, I know you think of what I do as being Belgrade correspondent. But if I live in Ljubljana, it's actually easier for me to get to Pristina from Ljubljana than it is from Belgrade, because I can get a direct flight on Adria. And the only place which was more difficult for me to get to was Belgrade. It was easier for me to get to Zagreb. It was easier for me, just as easy to get to Sarajevo or Skopje or what have you. And that all worked very well for a little while.
For a little while. But then you stuck here now, so you reported from the region. Okay, you have to drive and not to. You have to rent a car, and you're not able to fly. How do you get to Pristina actually?
It would be tricky. I mean, what I used to do from Belgrade was I'd fly to Skopje and then get a car from Skopje. Because do you know what the most common cause of death for a foreign correspondent is? Correct. Number one is road traffic accident. Yeah. I mean, and this is it. And you've got to be realistic about these things. And those roads into North Kosovo, there are shrines on them at regular points.
Yeah.
They're not from people being shot. They're from people driving off the edge.
It's actually even more dangerous if you cycle. But what you don't do, of course. But anyway, so yeah. But you can get there, so you cover all the region, and you're quite successful because there's a lot to report.
There's a lot to report, but the great thing is that we're not generally in this region the sort of hard news region, which is really nice because it's the pace of it is slightly different. It's not generally there's something happening now and I've got to report on it. There's generally a bit more room to maneuver than that on an international basis. I mean, of course, these stories domestically in all of the countries, they'll have a totally different rhythm to them. But my mind's always on the international audience. What's going to grab their interest? And so it's a lot more selective. Yeah, and that makes the rhythm of it very different, and it's great. So there's a lot of features journalism, much more than there is on the day news reporting, and that's nice. Although again, sometimes you can get tied up with that. You end up with this, keeping about 10 plates spinning in the air at the same time.
But of course, there are also, let's say, world-shaking news from the region, and I can imagine you often go to Belgrade, and of course there was this situation with the tennis player Novak Djokovic, who actually, everybody lost in this story. I mean, Djokovic and the Australians, but there was actually one winner of the whole. Okay, there were two, Rafael Nadal and Guy Deloney, who was actually, you were spot on, literally, and so that really made you even more famous than you are, because you were there and you were actually covering a 24/7 story on him.
It was a terrific story to do, because the big stories I've done in the past in this region, the really big ones, refugee crisis and the 2014 floods, those would have been the two big stories. And then things connected with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, so the Mladic verdict, the Karadzic verdict, 20th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre. Those stories are not fun. They're really intense. And because I spent 8 years in Cambodia and I was dealing with the Khmer Rouge Tribunal there, which is another criminal tribunal, to do with genocide. I've spent 18 years interviewing people whose families have been murdered, and sometimes interviewing the murderers themselves as well. And it didn't get to me for a long time, but there was a point. I think it was just before the Mladic verdict, and I was at the Children's Monument in Sarajevo with a man whose 13-year-old son had been shot and died during the siege of Sarajevo. And he took a photograph of his son out of his pocket, kissed it, and placed it on the children's memorial. And I lost it. And that was, I think, the first time. And it's probably probably connected with the fact that my own son was, I think, somewhere around that age at the time, or at least approaching it. But that was the first time it really got to me. Until that point, I'd felt, okay, I'm a witness to these proceedings. People want to talk. They feel good. They genuinely do. They always want to be heard, and that's part of justice for them. But then, yeah, I guess everybody's got a cup, and that was the point at which mine was filled. So with the Novak Djokovic thing, it was wonderful because nobody died. Nobody was being tortured apart from poor Novak, who couldn't get gluten-free food. That was the worst element of the story. I mean, you know, you have his family who are eccentric, to put it mildly. But it was very entertaining, and it was very full-on. It was very busy, and you needed to tell it in a particular way. And I love live broadcasting. It's like I say, I always wanted to be a broadcaster, more than a journalist, a broadcaster. And it's just great fun, you know. You've got a microphone in your hand, you know, talking to the camera, lots of interesting toys to play with, all the rest of it. And you can have a lot of fun with it. And we did. And it also showed people internally in the BBC how valuable it is to have somebody who knows the patch, who can give that context to the story that somebody flying in wouldn't have been able to give. And that my contacts book is absolutely spot on. That we had an interview with President Vucic within 1 hour of Djokovic getting his deportation notice. So, you know, it was because, you know, you've built those relationships over the years, and that's when it pays off. You know, my cameraman wasn't delighted about it because he's not a fan of the Progressive Party or Alexander Vucic, you know. And I'm having to say to him, for goodness sake, you know, Djokovic has just been deported and we're talking to the president of the country, you know, on a Sunday morning. That's pretty good going. So it was a lot of fun, and it was relentless in a good way, rather than something like the refugee crisis, which was relentless in quite a harrowing way. You know, there was that disconnect of Europe. Like, I remember vividly, it was in no man's land between Croatia and Serbia, one of these border crossings near, I've forgotten what the name of the border crossing is, but no, it's not that one. It's between Croatia and Slovenia. Ah, okay. And on the Croatian side, it was close to the Terme Sveti Martin.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Over there.
Whatever.
But it was one of these things absolutely pouring down with rain. These people had been offloaded from a Croatian train, I think, or the Croatian side had just offloaded them, shoved them through the border, and the Slovenian side weren't letting them through. There's about 1,000 people, lots of families. It was about 4 degrees. I don't think anybody was going to die of hypothermia or anything, but it was just utterly, utterly miserable. And there was no good reason for these people being kept in these miserable conditions. And we, of course, were going back to our nice warm hotels at night, I was just wandering in and out of the border point, not even really showing my press pass, just because I looked like I belonged. I looked like I had the right to walk to and from over the borderline. And these guys who were from Syria and Iraq and so forth, they looked wrong. They were not going to be let in and out. And I broke the rules. You're told when we do our hostile environments courses when every 3 years we're told how not to get ourselves killed as journalists. And one of the things they say to you is don't get involved. And these people were begging me, can you please find out what's going on? Please, please. And what are you going to do? Are you going to say, no, I can't get involved? So, take my press pass, shove my way through the crowd, hold it up to the Slovenian border police and say, can you tell me what's going on? And they just said, no comment. that was about the size of it. So, the Djokovic story was a delight compared to that.
And plus, it was actually a story which ran all the day because it was happening in Australia in a completely different time zone.
It was perfect. It was perfect because it was just after New Year. So this is a silly season. We call it silly season in Britain, usually July, August, when the politicians are on holiday and nothing much happens. That's silly season. And all sorts of odd stories get on air in silly season. But there's a second silly season which most people don't talk about, and it's the period just after New Year. Yeah. Because again, lots of people are still on holiday. And importantly for me...
The Slovenians call it dry January because they're not drinking after...
It's journalistically dry as well, though, isn't it? And the great thing is a lot of the correspondents are on holiday.
Yeah.
So there was no danger of them flying somebody in from London or Brussels. One of their network correspondents... So I was left to it. And although they did fly me out a producer from Brussels to work with, which was wonderful, and I had my camera crew in Belgrade, and that was just great. So you'd have Melbourne was 10 hours ahead of Belgrade time. So when they were awake, I could be asleep, and when they were getting ready to go to bed, I could be taking over first thing in the morning in Belgrade. And I mean, I know it was a silly story in a way, but everybody was interested in it. And I know from looking at the metrics that we get, the feedback we get from the website, it was a massive story for people.
Everything somehow summed up, your experience, your love of broadcasting, your know-how in sports, your contacts, you're actually.
Oh, it was perfect. I knew a lot of people in Serbian tennis as well because I'd done a story for Monocle magazine about Serbia's sporting soft power, which, I mean, we could do the same for Slovenia, frankly, these days. But at that time, because of Djokovic, because of a lot of the Serbian footballers, and Ana Ivanovic as well would be another one, I suppose. That was, Monocle does a soft power issue once a year. And I'd pitched this, that we should do something on Serbia's soft power, and they went for it. So I had a lot of contacts in Serbian tennis, and so again we were getting Viktor Troitsky was we were getting him at a moment's notice and that sort of thing, because that's the thing, that's what builds up when you are resident in a place.
And of course let's say the three letters BBC, they somehow open the doors, and of course I'm really happy that I'm actually employed by an organization which has really a good relationship to the BBC, especially BBC. We're an outside source. Yeah, well, we were in constant collaboration, although the BBC guys don't know much about it, but no, I mean, before I give the floor, of course, to the audience, another thing, because we call it a chat with a hat. Yeah, it's actually you inventing a sort of a communication with your. I was told that we should not use the word audience, but community.
Really?
Yeah. That's the new buzzword. So and it's actually, you being a proper journalist who thinks about how to do things even better and tries to communicate. And so I mean, tell us, and that's the last thing I ask you, about this idea of having, let's say, a daily short Twitter show in which you actually tell people what you will report about?
So this came from when my wife Lisa and I were sitting on the riverside in Ljubljana, and we had a cup of tea, and I was saying to Lisa, my colleague in The Hague, Anna Holligan, she's been doing these things on Twitter where she's riding her bike in The Hague and she's talking about what's happening in the Netherlands. I said, that's really terrific. It's nice. She just does a video, 2 minutes, sort of news headlines from the Netherlands. And she said, why didn't you do that?
Netherlands, it's boring. They don't have mountains. It's what can you do? What can you tell about Netherlands in 2 minutes?
Well,
on a bike, everybody's riding a bike there.
But that's part of the gag, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's playing into the national stereotype. But you know, as a cyclist, I thought, wow, that was a really great idea. And Lisa said, why didn't you do that? And I was like, I can't do the bicycle. Anna's doing the bicycle. I can't rip her off like that. That would be awful. And she says, well, why don't you just, you know, just do some stories? Why don't you just talk about what's, you know, every morning you're sending over a list of what's going on to the BBC, and which I do. I sort of go through all the regional news sources and send over a compilation of what's happening to the BBC in Brussels and in London. And she says, you're doing that every morning, and it's, you know, sometimes it's making it on air, but a lot of times it isn't. Why don't you just read some of that out? And I said, oh, yeah, that's not a bad idea. She said, oh, you should do that. I said, okay. And she said, no, I mean now. And, you know, she whips out her phone, turns on the video camera and said, right, go. And, you know, the instinct kicks in and you just look straight down the camera lens and you do your 3 stories and you try and do them in, you know, minute and a half, 2 minutes maximum. As it turns out, 2 minutes is the maximum you can upload to Twitter, generally. So the instinct was right. And as it happened, I was wearing a hat. It was this very hat. And it wasn't...
This will go to the Guy Deloney Museum.
They absolutely will. Yeah. And it was not meant to be chat in a hat, but then people started commenting on Twitter about the hat. I thought, oh ho, no matter what you think of what I'm saying, you like the hat. And I have a few hats, so I thought, okay, every day I'll wear a different hat. And then I mentioned this to Igor, and Igor provided me with a few more hats.
I rented you my hats.
So, and why not have a bit of fun with it? I did actually get to wear a hat on the BBC. I was very surprised. I was when I was standing in the snow outside Novak Djokovic's restaurant in Novi Beograd. And it was seriously sub-zero and snowing. And I had my hat on. There was a nice little, you know, peak of snow on there. And I said to them in the gallery down the line, I better take my hat off, hadn't I? And they said, no, you don't have to. You can keep your hat on, as the song goes. And so
Joe Cocker, and he's originally from Sheffield, so another music city.
But yeah, and it's a really fun way to get stories across. And I don't have a huge number of Twitter followers, and the videos don't get a huge number of views every day. But the feedback that I get from people, and just yesterday I was speaking to somebody in the International Commission on Missing Persons in Sarajevo, and they said, oh, I love your chat in a hat. It means so much to me. I get this really interesting perspective on what's going on in the region from what you're saying. Really nice to hear those sort of things. So it doesn't really matter how big the community is, in a way. It's reaching people who otherwise wouldn't be served in a way that they're being served. Mm. And I don't get paid for it at all. And I sometimes have to remind Lisa when she's trying to get creative with the camera shots that, you know, hey, remember, you know, time is money, etc., etc. But
no, but it's a pressure thing, and I think the whole setup of the story, you know, tells a lot about you. So you're actually picking advices from the right people. I mean, Lisa in this case, or so you like communication, and you're communicating in a very constructive and positive way. So that's why you also get good feedback, or you can use, let's say, foreign ideas to somehow implement them in a noble way. So I find it really nice, and it's a sort of a trademark you're setting. So it's great.
So one you know, it's one of these. There's a poem by a Liverpudlian poet called Brian Patton called "Burning Genius," and I can't read it because it makes me cry every time I read it. But I do like that phrase, "burning genius." And this is one thing that I would like at some point, that Chat in a Hat somehow is at some point recognised as being evidence of burning genius, which needs to be, you know, The other thing about being freelance, as I said, nobody holds your hand. Sometimes I think, God, wouldn't it be nice to be the talent? Wouldn't it be nice to just, sort of rock up and do your thing and get paid tons of money for it, and you don't have to, put the whole show on the road yourself? And that sometimes
well, guys, don't give up. Don't give up. It's still,
I'm open to
still
offers.
Possible. Yes. Okay, so that was it from my side. Dear community, any questions? It's not a national sport in Slovenia asking questions, but these are journalists mainly, so they probably are a little bit different.
Hi. Being a freelancer from Balkan and correspondent working for BBC, how you pick a story what's important for BBC from the Balkan? I mean, for us, everything is important in Ljubljana or in Slovenia, not including like even Balkan, but I mean, for BBC?
It's news sense, and this is something which has to be honed, and you hone it over a period of years. And if you know the output and you know the audiences and what works well on particular programs and particular bulletins and the websites and what have you, you just get a sense of it. Doing the daily updates for Brussels and London takes a little bit of it. I can be less selective with that. I can actually say these things are going on. And sometimes people will get back to me and say, hey, could you do us, a news piece for the website or dispatch for the radio, or can we have a TV live on that, which I hadn't been expecting. And there was an early lesson that I got from one of my editors way back in the day, who said never try and second guess the output, because they may want something completely different, but generally you think you know what's going to get traction. So Lisa and I will be discussing the stories every morning, and she'll say, how about this one? And I can't remember what it was this morning. There was something, oh gosh, it was about fuel prices in the region. I was, no, it's not going to make, but that's something that everybody's facing now. There was something that was particularly weird about the fuel prices, or what people were doing in reaction to the fuel prices. That would be a story, because it's something that everybody's facing, certainly across Europe at the moment. And if you've got a little angle on it, which is somehow different, then you're going to get that sort of traction. But if it's just, fuel prices are going up in Slovenia, it's not going to fly. I mean, it wouldn't fly if it was fuel prices in Serbia either. But, Serbia's gas deal with Russia, now that's a story. That's where the difference is. And
what about visiting Ukraine during the war? Like if Prime Minister, for example, goes there. Like...
The issue you had there, and I knew this would happen, is that Poland and Slovakia, but certainly Poland was the big one. That was the one they were going to go for. And I could tell that Slovenia was going to get lost in the wash, as it were. And so I was in communication with my editors we were all in an email group, myself, Rob in Prague and Adam in Warsaw. We were all pitching in our various lines. So some of it probably did make it to output. But that was always going to be, again, it wasn't a Slovenia story. It was a Poland/Ukraine story, if you see what I mean. So I knew that wasn't going to get any traction from my end. And this is the issue at the moment. There's one story, isn't there? Really. I mean, it's like we had COVID was the one story for such a long time. And now we've got one story, which is Ukraine, I mean, internationally speaking. And you're really going to have a really interesting angle or something really extraordinary to get on air at the moment. Which is why I'm concentrating on doing features for Monocle magazine at the moment.
No, it's good to have let's say a plan B also. Okay. Yep.
Hi, I have two questions. First, I'm interested in what does your wife do, so she's able to move with you all around?
Well, and she's advising you, apparently.
And she's
in a really good way.
And the second question, what was the biggest, I would say, culture shock, maybe, comparing growing up in Britain and then living in Belgrade or Ljubljana?
So Lisa's a management consultant. She specializes in change management, and we've got 2 children. So what she was doing was sort of 60 hours a week with Ernst & Young when we lived in London. I mean, obviously she doesn't do that anymore. And we have worked more and more together over the years on the journalism side of things. So initially, Lisa was, when I was setting up as a freelance, Lisa was my own personal change management consultant, doing the business plan, doing a lot of the things that I need to make the business work. Making sure I get paid, making sure I've got good records of what I've done, and planning and organisation. That was all Lisa put that. She put all of that into the business, and over the past couple of years, because with COVID, it was very obvious that I wouldn't be able to do the job as I had done it. We thought, okay, what's going to generate income? Where can we actually add value and get income from it? And it was doing these daily updates and then following on from that with pieces for the website, dispatches and lives and so forth. And so she started doing that every morning, basically copy tasting every morning with me. And then, like I said, Chat in the Hat was her idea. And I'm trying to get her at the moment. I've asked the BBC if they can give us some formal training in doing video. She's got a great eye. She's very, very good at setting up the shots. She's an artist, so she's naturally very good at that sort of thing as well. She's got great ideas. So I'm hoping to tempt her more away from the world of business consultancy. And there's a lot of husband and wife news gathering teams in the freelance world. So
also in Slovenia, it's
yeah. So
really?
I mean, we could do that. And then in terms of culture shocks, we were walking around walking down the road. At the moment, we live smack bang in the middle of the old town, Stari Trg, and I was just walking past what's it called? Slaščičana pri Vodnjaku or something? Is that what it's called? Just actually on Gornji Trg, really, at the end when Stari Trg turns into Gornji Trg. And just marvelling at the pavement cafes, and this is really a Europe thing versus a UK thing, especially if you grew up in Britain in the 70s and the 80s. It was grey, it was dirty. What was a pavement cafe? People didn't have tables outside. You mad? And I just marvelled at this when I first did extensive... I travelled around Asia a lot more than I did Europe, and it was really only in the mid-90s I first started seeing European cities, and that's what blew me away. It was just different. It almost seems like a completely different pace. We all seem like we're scurrying in Britain, probably because the weather's so terrible and the public transport is so crowded. And to see these people just luxuriating these very attractive pavement cafes. And so it isn't really a Belgrade or Ljubljana thing, because I think I was used to it by then. We still don't do it well in Britain. We try, but we get it wrong, and they're in the wrong places. And there's a lot of great things about being British and about Britain, but the outdoor cafe lifestyle is not one of them.
Perhaps if you survive your suicide attempt, it will change. But we shall see. Okay.
Hi. Maybe just a question. Here I am. Hi. How much do you cooperate with local journalists with doing your job, or who do you lean on when you need like local context?
Igor and I know each other quite well.
Besides, yes.
So I do talk. The important thing, though, is there are journalists who take. There are, and I've encountered them as well. I mean, there was one BBC correspondent, one of their network correspondents, when I was in Cambodia, who was absolutely notorious for just being a vampire. He'd want to come in and he'd want to suck all the blood out of your stories, and he'd leave nothing for you. And I got his number very quickly, and I just shut him down after that. I wouldn't have anything to do with him. And when I was in Seoul in South Korea, it turned out they were having the same experience. And I think it's terribly important to try and be as independent as you can, because we're in a position where, we're not going to know as much as the local people at all, but we can't just go asking. We have to try a bit, for goodness sake, to develop our own contacts, our own networks. And I don't work with fixers generally either, for the same reason. I want that knowledge to be my knowledge. I want it to be earned, and I want those relationships to be built as well, so that when it comes down to it, the relationships with me, not with a local, national journalist in Belgrade or in Pristina or what have you, who's set things up for me. So I've got very friendly relations with journalists in a lot of places, but I try not to take too much from them, and I try to give back, and I try to offer first as well in many situations. Like when we were doing the Djokovic story, we had a colleague from the BBC Serbian network, BBC na Srpskom, who was with us. And when she wasn't around, I was making sure that the interviewees we were doing would do at least one answer in Serbian that she could use for her output, because she was giving to us, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't a one-way street. And I think that's desperately important. It's got to be, if it's going to be cooperation, it's got to be a real cooperation.
Okay, if I may add something, it's probably one of the strongest points you have. You build relationships, and as far as I know your history, you're always trying, to really nourish and establish and nourish them, and that's for a journalist job. It's essential. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, can I just, in regards to the latest, the question before, but how is it from the content point of view? Is the view from the local journalist like a burden for you, because you have probably a different perspective?
Yeah, sure.
On a point.
I mean, I look at the local news sources all the time. I'm sorry, I'm saying local. Of course, these are national outlets that I'm talking about here, but I look at that all the time, and I know who's got what views. I mean, I've got lists of, which news outlets in Montenegro are pro-Djukanovic and which news outlets are anti-Djukanovic. I mean, I'm not going to get taken by surprise with these things, and it informs my reporting, but it doesn't create my reporting, if you know what I mean. I'm always going to have it matters a lot less to me in a very brutal sense, if you know what I mean. The stakes are lower for me. So if I've got a colleague in Belgrade who's desperately anti-Vucic, I can see his point. I can understand what he means, but I don't feel it viscerally like he does. And it's not my job to come across like that. It's quite interesting. You see at the moment the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the invasion by Russia. We had this story with the drone crash in Croatia, and I wrote that up for the BBC website. And I had a Ukrainian colleague who was really trying to influence what and how I wrote what I was writing, and I was pushing back against that, because it's not my job to represent things from that point of view. It isn't. So, does that answer the question?
Apparently, yes. Another question? Adrian?
Guy, after Japan, Cambodia, Serbia, Slovenia, are there any other countries or parts of the world currently on your wish list?
Yeah, it may not be now, but at some point I'd love to go to South America, and that'll be connected with the music. And so I'm a dilettante when it comes to Brazilian music, but I know a fair degree of it. So I'd love to spend some time in Brazil. I'm also a very bad surfer. And one of the reasons I'm a bad surfer is I've never managed to live in a place where I could actually surf every day. So I could do that if I were in Brazil. So Brazil would be good, but I think it would have to wait for a while because we've dragged our children around from Phnom Penh to Belgrade to Ljubljana, and bless them, they still seem relatively normal. So down the line, I wouldn't say no to that at all. There's a lot of the world, isn't there?
And there's a big Japanese community in Brazil.
There is. I used to play table football actually with a second generation Brazilian Japanese guy in a bar in Osaka.
Yeah.
And he was much better than me. I thought I was quite good at table football until I met him. Blimey.
So
I was like the other guy in Pinball Wizard.
Yeah.
I thought I was the bally table king, but I've just handed my pinball crown to him.
Oh yes, it's a really good film. And then the album of The Who is great. Okay, I think we're running out of time a little bit, but we're Slovenians, so we can add something to it. Any other question? No.
Hooray! I'm off the hook, am I?
We have exhausted everything what we wanted to. Was it anything you wanted to tell us without being asked?
I have written I have a little IKEA desk at home, which has got a little whiteboard on the back of it. And I attempt to organize myself on this. And I wrote something across the top of it a few weeks ago, which is something I always used to say to people. Because I feel that a lot of good things, a lot of serendipity. There's been a lot of serendipity in my life, and I wrote down on this board something which I always used to say, which was, I am a fundamentally lucky person. And it's truly how I feel. I mean, your careers in journalism can go lots of different ways. And I know that mine isn't the career that some of my colleagues at Five Live have ended up with. I mean, there's one of them, a friend of mine from Five Live, Susanna Reid. She's a national celebrity. She presents the Good Morning Britain show, formerly with Piers Morgan. Bless her. She was on Strictly Come Dancing and so on and so forth. There are people I know that are at that level. But I'm kind of quite happy with the way things have gone. It's been quirky. And I can live with that.
Well, I think we were lucky to have you here. So thank you very much. There was not so much talk about music. Okay, you mentioned that while you were working for Sony, and you mentioned music in regard to Brazil. We could actually do a really special show with you on music. What you actually did, you did in a way for Radio SI the other day.
They actually asked me to do this program called My Life, My Music. And I was slightly mortified because, I didn't want to talk about my life too much. And I thought the best thing I can do is make sure that I have lots of time to talk about the music. So they asked me to choose 8 songs. And the way I decided to do it was eight musicians or 8 acts that I'd actually had meaningful time with. So that was how I did it. And that was also a good way of eliminating lots of things, which would otherwise have been an impossible choice. But I also want to point out in this year's Emma contest, I actually knew 2 of the people competing. And that's one of the things I like about Slovenia is, you're never going to be too far from someone who's competing to represent Slovenia at Eurovision. And to have 2 of them, Gushti was my upstairs neighbour. Until last year, and Bo Rain is a friend of mine as well. So there we are. That had never happened to me before, to my knowledge, to know people at Eurovision. I would have been very proud had they gone to Turin. So,
well, perhaps next year.
At least they weren't Batista Cadillac.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, and of course for opening. Your heart and thoughts to us, and we're really happy to have you here, and being part of the Slovenian journalistic community. We're really proud of having you around. So take care. You go to Belgrade tomorrow.
First thing in the morning.
Safe journey to Belgrade, and then of course back home to Ljubljana.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Guy Deloni, and thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Boys and girls, for being with us. Goodbye. Na svidenje.